Hello, this video is made for entertainment and education, and today we're talking about something that makes modern people squirm a little: cannibalism and murder among our ancient relatives. We like to think that cruelty is something unique to our own species, a product of civilization, war, and religion. But the evidence says otherwise. Our ancestors killed each other, dismembered the bodies of their own relatives, and in some cases, ate members of their own kind, long before agriculture, cities, or writing ever existed. And no, this wasn't always survival in some extreme crisis. Sometimes it was just normal. Let's start in Croatia, at Krapina Cave. Back at the very start of the 20th century, in 1901, paleontologist Dragutin Gorjanović Kramberger dug up the remains of at least 20 Neanderthals who lived roughly 130,000 years ago. The bones were smashed. Long bones split lengthwise. Skulls cracked open to get at the brain inside. At first, scientists assumed this was some kind of burial rite or sacrifice. But modern cut mark analysis told a different story. Those cuts are identical to the ones left behind when butchering a deer or a bison from the same period. The meat was stripped off the bone using the exact same technique used to skin prey. A very similar picture shows up at El Cedrón Cave in Spain. Remains of 12 Neanderthals were found there, all of whom died around the same time, possibly even the same day. The bones show chop marks, splitting from marrow extraction, and even bite marks. Genetic analysis revealed this was a single family: adult men, women, teenagers, and children. The most likely explanation is that starvation forced the survivors of the group to eat their own dead relatives. This wasn't revenge, this wasn't warfare, this was desperation. But not every case of cannibalism can be explained by hunger. At Fontbrégoua Cave in southern France, researchers found the remains of 6 people who lived around 6,000 years ago, during the Neolithic, when agriculture already existed, and food, in theory, should have been plentiful enough for everyone. The bones carry the exact same butchery marks as the deer bones found in the same layer. Researchers suspect this may have been punishment, ritual, or part of an intertribal conflict rather than famine. Now let's go even further back. At the Gran Dolina Gorge, part of the Atapuerca complex in Spain, researchers found remains of Homo antecessor dating back around 800,000 years. This is one of the oldest known examples of cannibalism among hominins, period. The bones, including children's bones, carry characteristic cut marks from meat removal and fracturing from marrow, mixed together with the bones of deer and other animals in the very same trash heap. In other words, our distant relatives were literally tossed out alongside the leftovers from a hunt. Researchers at the site have proposed that cannibalism here wasn't about survival at all, but a way of eliminating competitors for territory and resources. Eating your neighbor was simply an efficient way to remove a threat and get a meal out of it at the same time. Now let's talk about violence that didn't always end with a meal, but definitely ended in death. One of the most famous sites is Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, a cemetery roughly 13,000 years old. Of the 61 buried skeletons, more than half show injuries from sharp weapons, arrowheads still lodged in bone, cuts across ribs and skulls. This isn't an isolated scuffle. It looks like an entire community was locked in prolonged conflict, possibly driven by a worsening climate and competition for resources along the Nile Valley. An even older example is Nataruk in Kenya, roughly 10,000 years old. At least 27 bodies were found there, including a pregnant woman whose hands, based on the position of the bones, may have been bound. Skulls show blunt and sharp force trauma, and one skeleton has an obsidian point lodged in the chest. Some call this the oldest solid evidence of organized intergroup violence, what some researchers describe as the first war in human history. Though it's worth noting that scholars still debate whether this can properly be called a war, or whether it was simply a single brutal massacre. Now for a personal tragedy involving one specific individual. Shanidar III, a Neanderthal skeleton found in Iraq, has a puncture wound in a rib that matches the shape of a thrown spear. The angle of impact is such that this Neanderthal almost certainly couldn't have inflicted the wound himself. Someone else threw a weapon at him from a distance. This is especially interesting because thrown weapons are traditionally considered a technology Neanderthals used less often than Homo sapiens did. If this really is evidence of an attack by another hominin, possibly even one of us, It's one of the few direct pieces of evidence for violence between Neanderthals and sapiens. And let's not forget individual murders that have nothing to do with war or hunger at all. Take Ötzi, the glacier mummy found in the Alps, roughly 5,300 years old. For a long time, people assumed he simply froze to death on a journey, but X-rays and further research revealed a flint arrowhead lodged in his left shoulder, which had damaged his subclavian artery. Ötzi most likely bled out and died within minutes to hours. Cuts on his hands suggest a struggle shortly before death. He still had his full toolkit, food, and weapons on him, so robbery is ruled out. This was a personal killing, possibly revenge, or the result of a conflict within his own community. Interestingly, death at the hands of another human being was probably a far more common cause of death in our deep past than we tend to assume. One large-scale study analyzing lethal violence across hundreds of mammal species, including fossil and modern human populations, found that for our earliest ancestors, the rate of death at the hands of a fellow member of the same species was around 2%. That's significantly higher than the average across mammals generally, though not the highest among primates. Back to cannibalism, we have to mention Gough's Cave in England. Remains found there date to the late Paleolithic, roughly 14,700 years ago. The bones show butchery marks identical to those on the deer and horse bones from the same layer. But here's the strange part. The skulls were carefully worked into a kind of cup or bowl. The edges are meticulously trimmed and smoothed. This doesn't look like an act of hunger or hatred. It looks like a complex ritual, possibly tied to honoring the dead, where eating the body and turning the skull into a vessel were part of a funerary rite, rather than punishment or aggression. And since we're already on Atapuerca, we can't skip what might be the single most famous example of the oldest solved murder in human history. It's called Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones, an underground cave system several stories deep, where remains of a species closely related to the ancestors of Neanderthals accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years, roughly 430,000 years ago. Among more than 28 individuals found there, one skull, known as Cranium 17, caught researchers' special attention. The frontal bone of this skull has two nearly identical fractures, right next to each other, with the same trajectory and shape. Forensic analysis, using the very same methods modern criminal investigators rely on today, showed that both blows were delivered by the same object from the same side with only a short interval between them, and that these were almost certainly strikes, not the result of a fall or a stray rock. The nature of the injury essentially rules out an accident. Someone struck this person on the head, twice in a row. The body was then thrown, along with others, down a vertical shaft 13 meters deep, a place bodies couldn't have ended up by accident, since reaching it required deliberate effort. The researchers who described this find called it the oldest compelling evidence of intentional murder in the history of the human lineage. So what does all of this actually tell us about our ancestors? First, that cannibalism was never a single phenomenon with a single cause. Sometimes it was hunger, sometimes ritual, sometimes a way to eliminate a rival. Second, that organized violence between groups existed long before states, armies, or writing. The idea of prehistoric humans as peaceful beings living in harmony with nature and their neighbors is most likely a romantic myth that doesn't survive contact with the archaeological record. But there's another side to this story too. Just as our ancestors killed and ate one another, they also cared for one another. We have skeletons of elderly, toothless individuals who clearly lived on thanks to relatives who chewed their food for them. We have skeletons with broken bones that healed, evidence of months of care during recovery. Violence and compassion, cannibalism and care existed side by side in the very same communities. We are complicated creatures, and we always have been. It's also worth remembering that everything we covered today is only a tiny fraction of what actually happened over hundreds of thousands of years of human history. Most of our ancestors' bodies never survived to the present at all. They were eaten by scavengers, broken down by microorganisms, or simply dissolved in acidic soil, long before they had any chance to fossilize. Which means every single find showing signs of violence or cannibalism that we do have is an exceptional stroke of preservation, not a rare exception in an otherwise peaceful picture. It's entirely possible that the real scale of violence and cannibalism among early hominins was far greater than anything we can reconstruct today, simply because the vast majority of the evidence never made it into our hands. That's it for today. If you want to keep learning about how our ancient ancestors survived, killed, ate, and loved, subscribe, hit like, and I'll see you in the next video.